There's a question almost everyone asks after leaving a narcissistic relationship, even if they never say it out loud. Will they ever feel what they made me feel? It's a question born from sleepless nights, unanswered conversations, and the strange injustice of watching someone who caused so much emotional damage appear to move on as though nothing happened. You remember every promise they broke, every moment they made you question your own reality, every apology that somehow became your responsibility to accept. Meanwhile, they seem untouched, laughing, posting photographs, beginning new relationships, telling a version of the story where they're somehow the victim. From a distance, it can feel as though they escaped every consequence. Today, we're going to examine that belief carefully, because hidden inside it is an assumption that quietly keeps many people emotionally connected long after the relationship has ended. The assumption is this: if they could only feel the same pain they caused me, I would finally be free. It sounds reasonable, it even sounds fair. But psychological freedom rarely arrives that way. Before we explore what actually reaches a narcissistic personality, we need to understand why revenge almost never produces the peace people expect. When you've been emotionally manipulated for months or years, your nervous system naturally searches for balance. It wants the story to make sense. It wants justice to exist. It wants the emotional debt to be paid. That's completely human. The problem is that justice and healing are not always the same thing. Justice looks outward. Healing looks inward. One depends on another person's experience. The other depends on your own. Many people unknowingly spend years postponing their recovery because they keep waiting for visible evidence that the narcissist is finally suffering. They imagine an apology, a public failure, a lonely future, some dramatic realization where the narcissist finally understands everything they destroyed. But notice what this waiting quietly accomplishes. Even after the relationship ends, your emotional state remains tied to their decisions. Whether you feel peace tomorrow depends on whether they regret yesterday. That's still a form of control. It's simply become invisible. This is why the most meaningful question isn't, how do I make them hurt? The more powerful question is, what kind of pain actually reaches someone whose entire psychological structure was built to avoid emotional accountability? Those are very different questions. To answer them, we need to separate ordinary emotional pain from narcissistic injury. Most people experience pain as information. They lose someone they love. They reflect. They grieve. They grow. Pain becomes a teacher. For someone organized around protecting a fragile self-image, emotional pain is experienced differently. Instead of inviting reflection, it often activates defense. Blame replaces responsibility. Anger replaces sadness. Denial replaces curiosity. The goal isn't understanding what happened. The goal is escaping the uncomfortable feeling as quickly as possible. That distinction explains why so many confrontations end in frustration. You arrive hoping for honesty. They arrive prepared to protect their identity. Those are two completely different conversations. And because they're different conversations, they almost never produce the closure you hoped they would. This brings us to something that surprises many survivors. The deepest pain for a narcissistic personality isn't necessarily being insulted. It isn't being shouted at. It isn't even losing a single argument. Those experiences may trigger anger, but anger isn't the same as lasting psychological impact. What truly unsettles a control-dependent personality is something much quieter. It's the moment their familiar strategies stop producing familiar results. Think back to the beginning of the relationship. Perhaps you explained yourself repeatedly. Perhaps you defended your intentions. Perhaps you apologized simply to restore peace. Perhaps every emotional reaction you had became something they could influence. Without realizing it, your responses became predictable. Predictability creates control. Control creates emotional certainty. Now imagine something changing, not dramatically, quietly. You stop arguing. You stop trying to convince them to understand. You stop chasing explanations. You stop treating every accusation like a problem you must solve. Suddenly, the emotional map they've relied upon no longer works. This isn't punishment, it's unpredictability. And unpredictability is uncomfortable for anyone whose emotional stability depends on controlling outcomes. Notice something important. None of this requires cruelty. None of it requires manipulation. None of it requires becoming like the person who hurt you. It simply requires refusing to participate in the old pattern. That distinction matters because many people confuse revenge with boundaries. They're not the same thing. Revenge tries to create suffering. Boundaries simply stop providing access. One is focused on changing another person. The other is focused on protecting yourself. Ironically, healthy boundaries often have a greater psychological impact than dramatic confrontation ever could. Why? Because boundaries remove something manipulation quietly depends upon. Access. Access to your attention. Access to your emotional reactions. Access to your availability. Access to your willingness to keep playing the same role in the same emotional script. When that access disappears, something unusual happens. The old strategies begin losing effectiveness, not because the narcissist suddenly becomes emotionally aware, but because the environment that allowed those strategies to succeed no longer exists. This is the first major truth worth understanding. The greatest emotional discomfort rarely comes from the words you say. It comes from the patterns you stop participating in. And that is where today's conversation truly begins. If refusing to participate in the old pattern is where your freedom begins, the next question naturally follows. What happens inside the narcissist when that pattern suddenly stops working? Most people imagine an immediate emotional collapse. They picture endless regret, sleepless nights, or a dramatic realization that everything has been lost forever. Real psychology is usually much quieter than that. What actually happens is something far more unsettling. The narcissist is forced to confront uncertainty. Not necessarily uncertainty about whether they loved you, not even uncertainty about whether they made the right decision, but uncertainty about something their psychological structure depends upon more than almost anything else: predictability. For a long time, they knew exactly how the relationship worked. If they withdrew affection, you reached out. If they criticized you, you defended yourself. If they disappeared, you waited. If they returned, you hoped this time would be different. Whether those interactions were healthy or unhealthy isn't the important point. The important point is that they were familiar, and familiarity creates psychological comfort. The moment that rhythm disappears, something changes. Imagine someone walking through a house they've lived in for years. Every light switch is exactly where they expect it to be. Every door opens in the same direction. Every room feels predictable. Now imagine returning one day to discover that nothing is where it used to be. The house hasn't become dangerous, it's become unfamiliar. That unfamiliarity creates anxiety. Something very similar happens when the emotional patterns that once gave someone a sense of control suddenly stop producing the expected response. For the first time in a long time, they don't know exactly what comes next. That uncertainty often explains behaviors people misunderstand after the relationship ends. A sudden friendly message, an unexpected apology, a casual excuse to reconnect, a seemingly innocent question. Many people immediately assume these actions are proof of love. Sometimes they're interpreted as evidence that the narcissist has finally changed. But before reaching that conclusion, it's worth asking a different question. What changed first? Did genuine accountability appear? Or did predictable access disappear? Those are not the same thing. Real change begins with responsibility. Control begins with restored access. Confusing the two has kept countless people trapped in cycles they believed had finally ended. Another important misunderstanding deserves attention. People often believe the greatest punishment for a narcissist would be seeing you happy. There is some truth in that idea, but not for the reason many assume. Your happiness is powerful because it represents independence, not because happiness itself hurts someone. Think about what emotional independence communicates without saying a single word. I no longer require your approval. I no longer organize my life around your reactions. I no longer measure my worth by your attention. Those messages cannot be argued away because they aren't spoken, they're lived. And lived reality is much harder to manipulate than spoken emotion. This is why genuine healing often feels strangely quiet. There's no dramatic announcement, no final speech, no perfectly crafted message explaining everything they did wrong. Instead, your life gradually becomes less organized around their presence. One day you notice you didn't think about them until lunchtime. Another day you realize you laughed without comparing the moment to the past. Weeks later you make an important decision without wondering what they would think. These moments appear ordinary. Psychologically, they're enormous. Because every one of them represents another piece of your identity returning home. There's another aspect of this process that's often overlooked. The narcissist may initially mistake your silence for temporary distance, then for anger, then perhaps for a game. If those explanations no longer fit reality, something uncomfortable begins happening. The familiar narrative stops working. Human beings naturally create stories that explain other people's behavior. Healthy people revise those stories when new evidence appears. People who struggle with accountability often revise reality instead. That's why your consistency matters so much. One healthy boundary means very little if it's abandoned the first time someone applies pressure. Consistency teaches something words never can. It teaches that the old pattern is genuinely over. This doesn't happen overnight. It develops slowly, one decision at a time, one boundary at a time, one moment of choosing peace instead of emotional reactivity. Another mistake many survivors make is believing they must somehow prove they've healed. They imagine the perfect social media post, the perfect appearance, the perfect life that silently communicates, "Look how much better I'm doing." But healing isn't a performance. The moment recovery becomes another attempt to send someone a message, your attention quietly shifts back toward them. Real healing has no audience. It's what happens when nobody is watching. It's choosing peace on an ordinary Tuesday. It's sleeping through the night without replaying old conversations. It's recognizing manipulation without feeling obligated to fix it. Those victories rarely receive applause. They're still victories. Perhaps the most significant emotional shift happens when you stop asking how to make someone else experience your pain and begin asking how to ensure you never abandon yourself in order to keep another person. That question changes the direction of recovery, because every unhealthy relationship teaches something, not only about the other person, about ourselves. Where did we ignore our intuition? Where did guilt become stronger than self-respect? Where did hope become more persuasive than evidence? These questions aren't invitations to blame yourself. They're invitations to strengthen yourself. Growth begins the moment experience becomes wisdom instead of identity. You are not defined by what happened. You are defined by what you choose to build afterward. Ironically, that's the one outcome manipulation can never fully control. A narcissistic relationship often depends on convincing you that your emotional stability comes from them. Healing quietly proves the opposite. Your stability was always capable of growing from within. It simply needed space to breathe again. And once that process truly begins, something remarkable happens. The question slowly stops being, "How do I make them feel the pain they caused me?" It becomes, "What kind of life becomes possible now that I no longer need to carry that pain for them?" That question doesn't erase the past, but it does something far more valuable. It gives your future back to you, and that is where the deepest form of freedom quietly begins. One final idea brings everything together, because it changes the goal entirely. At the beginning of recovery, most people believe the greatest victory would be watching the narcissist experience the same confusion, heartbreak, and sleepless nights they caused. That desire isn't unusual. When you've spent months or years trying to make sense of emotional manipulation, fairness feels deeply important. You want life to balance the scales. But as healing progresses, something unexpected begins to happen. The need for that balance slowly starts to disappear, not because the past suddenly stops mattering, not because the pain wasn't real, but because your emotional energy gradually finds a new direction. Instead of asking, "How do I make them suffer?" you begin asking, "How do I make sure I never lose myself again?" That question is far more powerful because one question depends on another person's experience. The other depends entirely on your own growth. One keeps you emotionally connected to the past. The other quietly builds a future that no longer revolves around it. There's another misunderstanding worth correcting. People often assume that the greatest punishment for a narcissist is rejection. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. What consistently has the greatest psychological impact is something much less dramatic. Irrelevance, not hatred, not revenge, not constant conflict. Irrelevance. Think about why. Conflict still creates connection. Arguments still provide attention. Trying to prove them wrong still keeps them emotionally involved in your life. Even resentment can become another form of attachment. But indifference is different. Indifference doesn't perform, it doesn't explain, it doesn't seek recognition. It simply continues living. And that's incredibly difficult for anyone who depends upon emotional reactions to feel significant. This doesn't mean pretending not to care. Pretending is still performance. Real indifference isn't an act. It's what naturally develops when your attention becomes invested in something healthier than the relationship you left behind. That process cannot be rushed. It cannot be forced. It grows quietly through ordinary decisions, choosing friendships that feel safe, developing routines that restore your peace, learning hobbies that reconnect you with yourself, building a career because it fulfills you, not because you hope someone else notices. These choices appear unrelated to healing. In reality, they are healing. Every healthy habit reminds your nervous system that life is becoming larger than the pain it once revolved around. Another important shift happens when you stop viewing boundaries as something you use only with difficult people. Healthy boundaries aren't emergency tools. They're everyday expressions of self-respect. You stop over-explaining simple decisions. You stop apologizing for reasonable needs. You stop believing that protecting your peace requires someone else's permission. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you emotionally available to the people who genuinely value mutual respect. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside all of this is surprisingly simple. The narcissist taught you many things unintentionally. They taught you what inconsistency feels like, what manipulation sounds like, what emotional exhaustion looks like. Now life gives you an opportunity to learn the opposite, what consistency feels like, what emotional safety feels like, what respect feels like. Those lessons deserve just as much attention as the painful ones. Otherwise, recovery becomes focused entirely on avoiding harm instead of building joy. And that's too small a goal. Healing isn't merely the absence of manipulation, it's the presence of authenticity. It's laughing without wondering how someone will react. It's expressing an opinion without fearing emotional punishment. It's resting without feeling guilty. It's loving without constantly proving your worth. Those experiences may sound ordinary, but after surviving an unhealthy relationship, they become extraordinary. One day you'll notice something remarkable. You'll hear the narcissist's name, and your body won't tighten. You'll remember an old conversation, and instead of replaying it for the 100th time, you'll simply recognize it for what it was. A chapter. Not your identity, not your future. Just a chapter. That's when you'll understand something many people never expect. The greatest way to make a narcissist feel the pain they put you through was never to create more pain. It was to stop carrying theirs, to stop participating in the patterns that once gave them influence, to stop measuring your worth through their approval. Because when you reclaim your peace, your attention, your confidence, and your ability to trust yourself again, you quietly remove the very thing manipulation depended upon: your willingness to abandon yourself. And once that disappears, the relationship loses its psychological power over you. That is the ending most people don't imagine when they first begin healing. They expect revenge. What they eventually discover is something much greater: freedom, not because someone else finally changed, but because you did. And unlike revenge, freedom is something no one can ever take away from you again.